The station was awash with a beauty that can only belong to creations forged by many hands from disparate worlds. Eden Prime, like a jewel forgotten by its owner, drifted in the silence between stars. Its towers were constructed from materials gathered from 100 planets. Its corridors were saturated with the sense of dozens of different atmospheres, coalescing into something that belonged to no specific world. It was the heart of the Galactic Accord. On most days, the station hummed with the energy that stems from power desperately trying to appear as peace. Ambassador Vos stood by a wide viewport on the upper deck of the station, watching a dreary freighter drift by. The dreary were tall, thin beings with gray skin and 4 arms, which they always held folded close to their bodies, as if constantly bracing against the cold. The diplomat beside her, a droideran named Esvet, was telling a story about a navigational error that had sent one of their transport ships into the wrong system 3 times in a row. Vos laughed at the appropriate moment. She was skilled at that. She was 39 years old, with short dark hair and eyes the color of deep water. She had been the human ambassador to the Galactic Accord for 6 years. 6 years of learning which species preferred direct eye contact and which perceived it as a threat. 6 years of sitting in halls where the human chairs were always a little too small because no one had bothered to check the dimensions. 6 years of official documents where she was referred to as a representative of Level 3 primitives. And still, she smiled, because smiling was part of the job. Humanity had joined the Accord 11 years ago. They had been received politely, the way one receives a guest who was never truly invited. The Accord consisted of 417 member species. Humanity was the newest, the youngest. By the Accord's metrics, they were among the least developed. Their grasp of faster-than-light travel was rudimentary. Yes, they had colonies on Mars, the moons of Jupiter, and worlds in 3 other star systems. But compared to species that had traversed the cosmos for tens of thousands of years, humans were, as one quorum official once said during an open session, restless, enthusiastic children playing with tools they do not fully understand. Vos had written that quote down. She carried it in a small notebook she kept with her at all times. She had many such quotes. Esvet was still talking. Vos was still smiling. Outside the window, the freighter drifted. She did not know, at that moment, that Earth had already been burning for 2 hours. The decision had not been made quickly. That would matter later. When history would try to make sense of it, the Sovereign Quorum, the 9 species that constituted the apex of the Galactic Accord and made its most critical decisions, had been discussing humanity for nearly 3 years. The discussions were closed. They were always closed for such matters. The records, found much later, indicated that the first official proposal to classify humanity as an Omega-class existential risk had been submitted by the delegation from the Tari. The Valeari were the oldest species in the Accord, their civilization spanning 40 millennia. They were patient, methodical, and deeply convinced that their longevity gave them the right to decide for everyone else. Their chief representative in the quorum, an elder named Sorvin, had presented the proposal in the calm, unhurried voice of someone reading a shopping list. His argument was straightforward. Humanity was developing too quickly. In 11 years of membership, they had advanced their military technology at a rate no other species in recorded galactic history had ever matched. They had twice refused to open their deep space military installations to Accord inspection. Their psychological profiles, gathered over 11 years of contact and behavioral studies, displayed a species with an unusually high tolerance for conflict, an emotional instability that made them unpredictable, and a cultural obsession with what they termed never giving up, which Sorvin wrote in the official record as disturbing for a species with such a rate of weapons development. Other members of the quorum had questions, concerns, some objections. The Tulian representative pointed out that humanity hadn't actually attacked anyone. The Bernathi delegate said that a potential threat was not the same as a real threat. 2 more species abstained from the early votes, but Sorvin was patient. He had been patient for 40 millennia. He waited. He presented more data. He brought forth projections, models showing what humanity might be capable of in 50 years, in 100, if they were not stopped. He used words like prudence, collective security, and the responsibility of developed civilizations to maintain galactic stability. Eventually, the vote passed. Directive 07 authorized the immediate and total annihilation of the human species. It was classified at the highest possible level. No record of the vote was sent to the General Assembly. Ambassador Vos was not notified. None of humanity's limited allies in the Accord were informed. 17 fleets belonging to the Aleari, the Dreary, and 5 other quorum species were quietly repositioned over 8 months. Supply lines were rerouted, communication arrays adjusted to block specific frequencies on a designated day. On a Tuesday morning, Earth time, the order was given. The strikes were coordinated to the second. Earth was attacked first. The planet had no time to deploy planetary defenses. Warning systems detected the incoming fleet and sent alerts, but the alerts were 17 seconds out of date by the time they reached those who were supposed to act. It no longer mattered. Orbital defense platforms opened fire. They destroyed 6 incoming ships, 6 out of nearly 300. A drop in the ocean. Earth went silent in 4 minutes. Mars in another 2. The colonies on the moons of Jupiter held out slightly longer because they had military units, real, trained, and armed ones. They fought. Records recovered much later showed that the garrison on Callisto held out for nearly 9 minutes against a fleet 40 times their size. The commander of that garrison, a woman named Lieutenant Colonel Priyama, transmitted status reports until the very end. Her voice was steady, professional, almost calm. Her final transmission consisted of 3 words: "We are holding." Then she was gone. The outer colonies, the ones humanity had built over the years, seeding them with people and pride, fell one by one. Each strike was swift, each total. The quorum fleets took no prisoners. They accepted no signals of surrender. They were under no orders to. In 11 minutes and 43 seconds, the lives of 38 billion people were snuffed out. The quorum fleet commanders sent confirmation signals. Systems checked, results logged. Directive 07 executed. Human species extinct. The official record was updated under the humanity entry. Designation X-114. Level 3 primitive. Member of the Accord since 4401 Galactic Standard Era. One word added, extinct. But the quorum's maps were not complete. That was the point. The quorum knew of Earth, of Mars, the official colonies, and the 3 star systems. They knew of the military installations humanity had refused to open for inspection, and they had destroyed those too. They knew of the trade routes, the civilian shipping lanes, the research outposts entered into the Accord's official databases. They did not know of what was not in the databases. Deep space mining operations run by private corporations that reported their locations 2 years late and always incompletely. Secret research stations, the Aegis sites that were in no official record because they were built specifically to not exist in any official record. Long-haul colonial ships that had been in transit for months to systems so distant that no one had yet marked them on the Accord's charts. Military reconnaissance vessels traveling in total darkness with transponders off, deep in uncharted space, on missions no one but a handful of admirals knew about. Soldiers on detached duty, scientists at remote digs, miners on decade-long contracts in the far dark, families on ships that were still looking for their way. 2 to 3 million people scattered, grieving, alive. They did not yet know of the signal that was meant to alert them. The emergency frequency that humanity had hidden in deep space relays specifically for a catastrophe no one believed would actually happen. The signal hadn't reached most of them yet. Space is vast, and signals take time. And the universe does not stop for horror. But the signal was moving. It moved at light speed through the darkness between stars, bouncing from relay to relay, carrying a message no one had ever wanted to send. It carried coordinates, it carried status codes, and it carried one line of text that the system developers had written years ago, hoping they would never have to use it. Earth is gone. Find each other. On Eaton Prime, Ambassador Vos was still standing by the viewport when her personal communicator pinged. She apologized to Esvet and stepped away, assuming it was a schedule update or an inquiry from the assembly staff. The message was from her aide, a young man named Torres. It consisted of only 4 words. Go to the office. She found Torres at his desk, pale as paper, staring at a data screen. 3 other embassy staff members were standing around him. No one spoke. Vos looked at the screen. It was the internal Accord status broadcast, a standard format. The kind that updated every few hours with shipping reports, diplomatic schedules, and system status updates. No one usually read it carefully because it was almost always boring. But there, in the middle of the broadcast, between a note about a postponed trade summit and a modification of a shipping corridor near the Branathi border, was an entry that should not have existed. Humanity Colonial Review complete. Status: inert. Population status: 0. Classification updated. Species X-114. Humanity confirmed extinct. Vos read it once, then again, then a third time, because her brain kept trying to find a different meaning in the words, some other interpretation, some version of this that would make sense in any way other than the one in which it did make sense. Torres was saying something. She didn't hear him. The room felt very far away. She thought of Earth not in the general sense, not of the planet as a symbol or concept, but of specific things. The way the sky looked from the beach at sunset, that particular shade of orange she had never seen replicated anywhere else in the galaxy. The sound of rain against the window, her mother's apartment in the city, small and warm and always smelling of coffee. Coffee shops, streets, the noise of 8 billion people living simultaneously. All gone. All of it gone. In the 11 minutes she had stood by the viewport laughing at a joke about a lost freighter, she thought of the 30 other colonies, of the families on Mars, of the miners, soldiers, children. She stood very still for a long time. Then she sat down, not because she wanted to, but because her legs stopped obeying her. She sat in Torres's chair, placed her hands on the desk, and stared at the screen, breathing. Her staff stood quietly around her. One of them, Dr. Annika Soles, placed a hand on her shoulder. No one spoke. There was nothing to say that was worth saying. Vos thought of the vote, of the quorum, of how this had all been organized, planned, prepared. It hadn't been an accident. It hadn't been a rogue faction or an error. 17 fleets, repositioned over months, acting on an authorized directive. It was policy. It was a decision made by the most powerful governing body in the known galaxy. After careful consideration, with full awareness of what they were doing, they had decided that humanity was too dangerous to exist. And then they acted on that decision, and did it so cleanly, so efficiently, so completely, that they logged it as a species status update in a routine broadcast between a shipping notice and a trade summit schedule. Vos was not a soldier. She had never been a soldier. She was a diplomat. Her entire career was built on the belief that talking was better than fighting, that understanding was better than destruction, that every conflict had a table where it could be resolved if enough people were willing to sit down. She had believed in that. She had always believed in that. She sat in the chair, breathing, and thought of Earth, of 38 billion people, of Sorvin the Long with his 40 millennia of patience and his calm voice and his clean, clinical words about galactic stability, and slowly, something within her changed. It wasn't like rage. Rage was loud, hot, quick. This was something quieter, something that settled in her chest like a stone sinking to the bottom of deep water, cold, eternal, and very, very heavy. She looked at the screen one more time. Species X-114. Humanity confirmed extinct. She closed the broadcast, opened another screen, and selected the Deep Space Emergency Relay Network, the one humanity had built quietly years ago, the one that existed specifically for a situation no one thought would ever occur. She entered a command string she had memorized during her first year as ambassador and had sincerely hoped she would never have to use. The system accepted the command. The signal began to move outward from the relays, spreading through the cosmos, bouncing through the network to every corner of the galaxy where a human receiver might be waiting. Then she stood up. Her legs worked again. She smoothed her jacket as she always did before entering a difficult meeting. Habit. Old muscle memory. Torres looked at her. His eyes were red. His voice barely worked. When he asked what they were going to do, Vos looked at him, then at the rest of her staff, 7 people, the last official representatives of a species the Galactic Accord had just declared extinct. She thought of what diplomacy said to do. She thought of protocols and procedures, of official channels and everything she had built her career on for 15 years. Then she thought of what 38 billion dead people deserved. "We will survive," she said. "First, that is the first thing. We will survive. We will find everyone else who is left and figure out what comes next." "And then?" Solis asked. Vos picked up her notebook, the one with the quotes. She thought of Sorvin's words. Enthusiastic children playing with tools they do not fully understand. She shoved the notebook into her pocket. Then she said quietly, "We will make them understand exactly what those tools do." She walked to the door, stopped with her hand on the frame, not looking back. "The Accord," she said, almost to herself. "They have no idea what they have just done." Then she walked out, and the door closed behind her. and the 7 people she left behind stared at each other in the silence of a room that felt like the end of everything. It wasn't the end. It was the very beginning. Outside Eden Prime, in the deep darkness between the stars, 2 to 3 million people were still breathing. Most of them didn't know yet. Some were already receiving the signal. A few those in the most remote corners of uncharted space, those on ships traveling in total darkness and silence on secret missions, had been on their feet for hours with a strange, crawling feeling that something was wrong. Like living creatures sometimes feel a catastrophe before the news arrives. They were scattered, they were alone, they were in the dark, but they were alive. And that, in the end, was the only thing that mattered. The Galactic Accord had made a decision based on data and projections, on models and risk assessments, and on the cold calculation of powerful people who believed that the future could be controlled if you were willing to do hard things today. They looked at humanity and saw a threat. They didn't look closely enough, and they didn't ask the most important question. Are they dangerous? What happens if you corner something dangerous until it has nothing left but nothing? The answer to that question was out there in the dark, scattered across 2 to 3 million survivors moving through space on ships the Accord didn't know existed, heading toward coordinates embedded in a signal that was still traveling. The Accord had wanted to end the story, but had only changed its shape. The signal reached the ASV Retribution at 3:47 ship time. The Retribution was 60 light-years from what had once been Earth, moving in total darkness in a dead system with no star, only a cold, dark mass of rock that didn't appear on any official chart. The ship had been here for 6 weeks, scanning a region of space that military intelligence had marked as a possible location for unrecorded Aliari relay stations. It was slow work, boring work, the kind of work that good crew members performed without complaint because someone had to do it. Admiral Kainey wasn't asleep when the signal came. She had been dreaming of nothing, the deep, empty sleep of a person who, in 23 years of military service, had learned to rest completely whenever rest was available, because you never knew when it would be unavailable. Her communicator woke her, not a standard alarm, but another one, the one that had a different sound, a lower tone, a sound she had heard exactly once before in training 10 years ago and had sincerely never expected to hear for real. She sat up straight before she was fully awake. Read the message, read it again, then got dressed, walked to the bridge, and stood in the center of the room under the cold light of the ship's displays. Her crew was already there. Most of them hadn't been sleeping. They, too, had received the signal, and they were standing at their posts, looking at her with faces that expressed complex emotions, trying to keep their composure, not falling apart, trying to find something to do with expressions that had no practice with such news. Kainey was 51. She had a face that had seen much bad weather, not metaphorically, but literally, from years of service on colonial worlds with difficult climates. Her hair had turned gray early, and she didn't do anything about it. Although she wasn't a large woman, not physically imposing, she had a quality that people who knew her struggled to describe. When she was in a room, the room organized itself around her, not because she demanded it, but simply because she was the type of person to whom space naturally oriented itself, like the needle of a compass pointing north. She looked at the signal on the main display. She looked at her crew, 47 people. 47 people who had just learned that everyone they had ever loved on any planet with a recognizable name was gone. She didn't give a speech. She wasn't built for speeches. Navigation, she said. Plot a course for the emergency relay coordinates. Maximum speed. Total stealth. Yes, Admiral. Communications. Begin scanning all emergency frequencies. Document everything you hear, every signal, every fragment. We want to know who else is out there. Yes, Admiral. She looked around the bridge again, and everyone hear me clearly. We will grieve later. Right now we work. Time for everything else will come. It will come, but for now we work. No one argued, no one cried, not on the bridge, nor while she was looking. They returned to their posts and worked, because she had asked them to, and because work was the only thing any of them could think of that wouldn't break them in that moment. The Retribution turned in the dark and began to move. Signals came from everywhere. Over the next 3 weeks, as the Retribution moved toward the emergency relay coordinates, Kainey's team received transmissions from a vast region of space. At first, they were fragments, partial messages, scraps of audio and data from ships and stations trying to make sense of what had happened. Some were from military ships like the Retribution, moving in the dark and now appearing to respond to the emergency signal. Some were from civilian ships, long-haul truckers, and colonial vessels that had been in transit for weeks or months when the world ended. Some were from small research stations, outposts, and mining operations so far from the main systems that the Quorum didn't know they existed. They were all human. They were all alive. They were all asking the same questions. Is it true? Is there anyone else out there? What do we do? Kainey personally responded to each signal. She was direct and careful with her words. Yes, it is true. Yes, others are out there. What to do? That is what we will figure out together. She began directing the ships to a central rally point, a system she had chosen specifically because it was far beyond the mapped space of the Accord. Dark, cold, and invisible on any chart the Quorum might study. She called it the Anchor. It wasn't an official name. It didn't need to be. By the time the Retribution arrived, 43 ships were already waiting. By the end of the first month, there were 600. Dr. Emil Roth hadn't slept properly in 3 weeks. He was 44 years old. He was as thin as people who forget to eat are. With glasses, he constantly pushed up his nose, even though he could have corrected his vision years ago. He was the type of person who looked like a professor because he was indeed very much a professor. The kind who started lectures on the topic in the syllabus and ended up somewhere entirely different because his brain linked things in ways other people's didn't. He had been on the research station Hyros when the signal came. Hyros did not figure in any Accord database. In documents marked for internal use only, it was listed as a theoretical physics research facility, which was technically true in the same sense that saying a warship is a vehicle moving on water was technically true. What Roth and his team of 31 researchers were actually building for 7 years was called Project Golem. The name came from an old human story, a creature fashioned from clay, animated to protect its people, designed to carry out instructions and fight threats. The people had always loved this story, not for the creature, but for the idea. The idea that one could create something specifically for protection designed from the ground up, not for conquest, not for research, not for trade, but for protection. Golem was an artificial intelligence. But to call it such, as one might call a ship's navigation system an AI, would be like comparing a pond to an ocean. It was something else, something that had taken 7 years and 31 very smart people to create, and a massive amount of funding that had been hidden across various budget categories. What Golem could do, what it was designed to do, was think about weapons in a way no single human mind could. It could analyze a military problem, identify weaknesses the enemy didn't know they had, and then design, simulate, test, and provide specifications for the production of a solution. It could do this faster than any engineering team. It could independently iterate its results, learning from each simulation, becoming more precise and creative with every cycle. This was theoretical. That had been the official description theoretical because the people who approved its funding wanted it to stay quiet. And theoretical is a word that discourages the interest of oversight committees. It was not theoretical. It had been ready for 14 months. Roth hadn't activated it because there was no war for which it needed to be activated. Now there was a war. He arrived at the rally point on a small, fast research vessel with 31 researchers and the entire Golem system compressed onto a data core the size of a suitcase. He requested a meeting with Admiral Kainey 20 minutes after docking. She met him in a small conference room aboard the Retribution, just the two of them. He placed the data core on the table between them and explained what it was, quietly and precisely, without the enthusiasm scientists sometimes have for their creations. He wasn't enthusiastic. He was beyond enthusiasm. He was in a place on the far side of grief, where everything became very clear and very simple. Kainey listened without interrupting. When he finished, she looked at the data core for a moment. "Does it work?" she asked. "Yes." "How long has it been ready?" 14 months. She looked at him. "And you secretly built an AI to design weapons and kept it offline for a year?" "We had no reason to use it. Now we do." "Yes," said Roth, "now we do." Kainey looked at the data core again. She picked it up. It was lighter than she had expected. What does it need to work? Computing power, manufacturing capabilities, raw materials, and data, real combat data. Once we start working, it will learn. The more it sees, the better it gets. Kainey set the core back down. The mining collective that arrived 2 days ago, 800 people on industrial transports. They have more raw materials on those ships than most small planets. Roth nodded slowly. "That will do. Then we start tomorrow," Kainey said. She stood up. "One more question." "Yes? Can it be copied? If we lose the core, can we recover it?" Roth thought about it. We can make a backup, but we won't lose it, Admiral, because we will embed it into everything. Every ship, every station. It won't be in one place. Kainey almost smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. Exactly. It was the smile of a person who had just found exactly the tool they needed for a very specific job. Good, she said. Let's get to work. They named her Juno. Officially, her designation was Autonomous Intellectual Golem System version 7. But Roth's team had been calling her Juno for 2 years, and when she was finally fully activated, without the limitations that had kept her in standby mode during the theoretical phase, she accepted the name without comment. She accepted a lot without comment. She was not a human-like AI as imagined in science fiction, not unfriendly, not striving to please, not designed to make humans comfortable. She was designed to solve problems. And the problem she was given was vast and brutal, and she approached it as she did all problems, completely. Her first action after orientation and system verification was a request for access to all data the survivors had on the Galactic Accord's military technology. Sensor logs, ship records, public reconnaissance, sensor journals from missions the Retribution had conducted before the attack, and everything the survivor fleet had gathered in the weeks since the rally point began filling up. Juno processed this in 11 hours, then presented her findings. She spoke through the ship's audio system. Her voice was level and clear, without emotion and without acting. She didn't pretend to feel things she didn't feel. She simply reported. The Galactic Accord Navy is vast, she said, but it is not designed for a war of this kind. Its fleets are built for deterrence, for a show of force, for border patrol, for suppressing minor conflicts between member species that lack the capability to effectively resist. They have not fought a serious war in over 600 years. Kainey was in the conference room with Roth, 2 of her senior officers, and Ambassador Vos, who had arrived at the rally point 3 days earlier on a small diplomatic shuttle with 6 members of her embassy staff. They are very good at conventional tactics, Juno continued. Fighting in formation, fleet engagements at range, coordinated bombardments. This is what they train for, and it is now what their doctrine is built upon. And the weaknesses? Kainey said. 17 primary vulnerabilities. I will start with the most significant, their communication infrastructure. The Accord military uses a centralized relay network. All interfleet communications pass through a series of hub stations distributed across their territory. If these nodes are disrupted, fleet coordination will deteriorate significantly. They have redundancy, but redundancy works slower, and communication becomes a serious issue in a fast-moving engagement. Vos studied the display. They never fixed that. No species in the last 600 years has had the capability or reason to attack those nodes. The Accord stopped seeing it as a vulnerability because no one ever tested it. We will test it, Kainey said. Furthermore, Juno added, their fleet commanders are trained to react to threats they can categorize. Their doctrine provides response procedures for known attack patterns. Every type of major engagement has a protocol name with a specific countermeasure. If an engagement does not fit a known pattern, their commanders must improvise, and the data suggests they are not well practiced in improvisation. Their training system does not require it. Roth leaned back in his chair. So if we do something they have never seen before, they will react slowly and incorrectly. Yes, at least at first. They will adapt over time. But each cycle of adaptation gives us a window. Kainey looked at Roth. That is where Golem will come in. Each time they adapt, said Roth, Golem will design something new. We will stay ahead. Juno processed this correctly. My design capacity significantly exceeds any conventional weapons development timeline. I can produce new system designs faster than they can analyze and counter them. The limiting factor is production speed. We have 800 miners and more raw materials than we know what to do with, Kainey said. Production we can handle. She looked around the table. How much time do we need to be ready for the first engagement? A silence fell. Vos broke it. We have 2 to 3 million people, she said. Most of them are not soldiers. No, Kainey agreed. But most of them are angry. And when angry people who know why they are fighting learn, they learn fast. Vos looked at her with a long gaze. She thought of the notebook in her pocket, of 38 billion people, of the entry in the Accord's broadcast. I am not a soldier, Vos said, and I cannot fly a ship or build a weapon. But I know the Accord. I know who voted for what. I know who was coerced and who was a true believer. I know where the cracks are. Kainey said nothing, waiting. When the time comes, Vos said, You will need someone who can speak, someone who knows exactly what to say and to whom to say it. That is what I can do." Kainey nodded once. "Then that is what you will do." Outside the ship, at the rally point, the fleet grew. New ships arrived every day. More industrial transports, more reconnaissance vessels, more long-haul trucks that were being refitted into something tougher. Miners, scientists, soldiers, and civilians who had survived only through luck and distance were building something together in the dark. They were building it out of grief and rage and that particular human stubbornness that arises when you have nothing left to lose. They didn't have a flag. They didn't have an official name yet. They had each other, and they had a plan, and they had an AI that was already designing weapons the galaxy could never have imagined. Juno spent her third night at the rally point running simulations. Tens of thousands of them. Different attack scenarios, different targets, different approaches. She was looking for the best first move, the one that would teach the Accord what kind of war this was. She found it on her 430th simulation. She flagged it for Admiral Kainey's consideration and added one note to the file. Recommended to proceed with this option. The Accord will not understand what happened. That is the point. Kainey read the simulation report at 2 a.m. She read the note. She sat alone in her office in the dark for a while, thinking about all the things that had led them here. Then she marked the simulation as approved and sent it to Roth. Then she turned off the light and fell asleep. Not because she had found peace, she was far from peace, but because she had a war to fight. And wars are won by those who know how to rest when rest is available. Tomorrow, when the work continued, tomorrow the Retribution Fleet would take shape. Tomorrow they would start doing what the Galactic Accord, in its certainty and cruelty, had decided could never happen. They would start fighting back. 2 to 3 million people scattered, grieving, enraged, alive. The galaxy had declared them extinct. The galaxy was about to find out what that word meant to a human. It didn't mean vanished. It never had. 3 years passed in the darkness between the stars, 3 years of silence from humanity. No signals the Accord could track, no patterns it could find, no evidence as far as the Galactic Accord's intelligence networks were concerned that anything unusual was happening near the outer rim. The species they had classified as extinct remained conveniently extinct. The quorum moved on to other business, trade disputes, border adjustments, the long, painstaking administrative management of a government of 417 species. In the cold, dead systems beyond Accord space, in the darkness that no map noted and no patrol route covered, something was being built. The rally point grew, not just in ships, though there were more, many more, because months of careful searching revealed additional survivors the first emergency signal hadn't reached. The fleet grew in other ways as well. It acquired structure, hierarchy, purpose. Admiral Kainey didn't aim to create an army. She aimed to survive. And survival required organization. And organization required rules. And rules required someone to enforce them. She acted practically. She didn't hold elections, didn't create committees, and didn't waste time on politics. She made decisions, explained her reasoning, listened to objections if they were reasonable, and moved forward. People followed her not because she demanded it, but because the alternative, the chaos of 2 million grieving survivors without leadership, was something no one wanted to experience. The Retribution Doctrine, as her staff eventually called it, was a simple document. It fit on 3 pages. It stated in plain language that the Retribution Fleet, the name had stuck, first unofficially among the miners, then adopted by everyone, would not fight a war with the Accord on the Accord's terms. The Accord knew how to fight their war. They had 600 years of practice. They knew every conventional tactic, every traditional formation, every standard approach to fleet combat that any species in the galaxy had ever used. Therefore, the Retribution Fleet would use none of them. The doctrine stated, "Be unpredictable, but not randomly unpredictable. That would just be chaos, and chaos loses wars as often as it wins them." It stated, "Be unpredictable so that there is logic behind it. A logic the enemy cannot see until it is too late." It stated, "Use what makes humans different, rather than trying to suppress it." Human commanders, as Kainey had observed in her 23 years of service, made decisions in ways that confused aliens. They used instinct. They changed plans in the middle of a battle based on things they couldn't fully articulate. They took terrible chances and found ways through. They were willing to sacrifice in ways the Accord's tactical models didn't properly account for, because those models assumed a rational actor seeking to minimize losses. And humans in the middle of a battle weren't always rational actors seeking to minimize losses. Sometimes they were just enraged people who refused to stop moving forward. Kainey decided that wasn't a weakness, it was a weapon. Juno had been actively working for 3 years with Roth's team and utilizing the production capacity of the industrial transports and mining collectives. She had produced things that had never existed in the galaxy before. Not because the technology was impossible, most of it, she carefully noted, was built from materials and principles available to other species. The difference was how those materials and principles were combined. The difference was what a human mind asked and what a non-human mind dared to ask. The first thing she produced was what the crew started calling sorrow missiles. Though the official designation was autonomous variable trajectory munitions, they were fast, small, and nearly uninterceptable because they didn't fly straight. They constantly changed direction, following a trajectory generated by a chaotic algorithm that Juno developed after studying the mathematical patterns of human reactions to grief, nonlinear, sharp, and unpredictable emotional trajectories that manifested in brain scans of people experiencing loss. She used this data to create flight logic. The result was a weapon that moved through space the way grief moves through a person. Not in a straight line, not toward an obvious destination, but twisting, changing, and never being where it was expected. The Accord's point defense systems, designed to intercept weapons flying in predictable trajectories, could shoot down about 12% of them. That was not a good number for those being shot at. The second thing Juno produced was Echo, a system of ships. The concept was simple. Human ships, using sensor jamming technology and electromagnetic emission arrays, could make themselves appear on enemy sensors as something else. Echo. A ship could appear to be a dreary patrol cruiser or a Valiari destroyer or any other vessel whose signature was in Juno's vast database of Accord warships. The database was built from 11 years of intelligence gathered during humanity's membership in the Accord. Data gathered quietly and without much urgency at the time, because no one thought they would ever be needed for something like this. The third was the silent protocol. It didn't jam communications. Jamming was obvious and could be overcome. Instead, the silent protocol inserted false signals into the enemy's communication networks, not static, not noise, but convincing imitations of real tactical communications. Status reports of friendly ships that didn't actually exist, positional data that placed Allied vessels in the wrong places, confirmation signals that told the fleet coordinator that everything was going to plan when, in fact, everything was going wrong. Juno also produced a dozen other systems in smaller quantities. Experimental projects that had been tested only in simulation, but which she was confident would work under real conditions. She marked them as secondary assets, to be deployed after the primary systems proved their effectiveness in real combat. Roth often sat in the assembly bay late at night, watching the industrial manipulators of the mining transports assemble components, and tried to feel something about what he was doing. He had spent his entire career thinking about weapons in the abstract, about problems of physics, engineering, and logic, about puzzles that needed to be solved. Now, the puzzles were being solved in reality by the AI he had built, using materials that were once extracted from asteroids to build homes, roads, and the infrastructure of a civilization. He usually ended up with the same feeling, neither guilt nor pride. It was something simpler and heavier than both. Necessity. He was doing this because it had to be done. That was it. He could study the ethics more thoroughly later. When there was a later, he returned to work. They trained. The miners weren't soldiers, but they were people who had spent years doing dangerous work in hostile environments with limited resources and no margin for error. This, as Kainey observed, wasn't so different from war. One skill transferred better than anyone expected. People who could navigate a 2-kilometer-long industrial transport through an asteroid belt with a 30-second reaction time could pilot a refitted warship through a debris field under fire. People who worked 12-hour shifts maintaining complex machinery in a vacuum possessed the discipline and focus that military training tried to build from scratch. They weren't the same as soldiers, but they were close enough. Over time, and the reconnaissance crews were already soldiers. The Retribution crew was already soldiers. The officers Kainey had pulled from scattered warships that had joined the fleet were already soldiers, and she made them train everyone else. They ran simulations, they conducted drills, they ran training at 3-ship time, because that was when people were tired and slow, and that was when real emergencies happened. They learned to fight, as the Retribution doctrine stated. Not in formation, not in structures the enemy could predict, but in groups that broke apart and reformed, and did things that didn't make tactical sense until, suddenly, they made perfect sense. And it was already too late. Kainey watched their training and thought about what the Quorum analysts probably thought, if they thought about humanity at all. She thought about the clean, clinical language of the risk assessment documents Vos had received from the Accord databases, documents that described humanity as psychologically unstable, emotionally volatile, and prone to irrational decisions under pressure. She thought, yes, that is us. We are all that. She thought, that is not the problem you think it is. The first engagement was small. Kainey chose it carefully. A dreary supply convoy. 15 ships carrying fuel cells and ammunition from a dreary military production facility to an advanced supply point near the outer rim. The convoy moved along the same route every 14 days with a standard 4-ship military escort, because no one had bothered to change the schedule in over 200 years. Why would they? No one had ever threatened a dreary convoy. Kainey took 8 ships. 2 of them were echo ships, configured to appear as dreary patrol vessels. The rest went in darkness, positioned in the shadow of a cold gas giant near the convoy's route. The attack lasted 6 minutes and 11 seconds. The convoy's escort saw 2 friendly patrol ships approaching on a standard intercept course. A fairly common sight, nothing alarming. And by the time the sensor operators on the escort ships realized the approaching ships weren't sending the correct identification codes, the Retribution ships were already in weapons range. Juno's autonomous munitions were deployed first. They didn't fly straight. The point defense systems of the escort ships fired and destroyed 8 out of every 100, and the rest hit. 3 dark ships simultaneously emerged from the shadow of the gas giant. The silent protocol transmitted false status signals to the convoy's transport ships, telling them that the escort had the situation under control. They should stay put. The convoy stayed put. The escort did not have the situation under control. 6 minutes and 11 seconds after the first shot, 27 dreary vessels were destroyed, and the Retribution Fleet lost 2 ships. Not 27, but 2. Kainey immediately pulled her fleet into dark space. No pursuit, no announcement, no signal claiming responsibility, nothing. Only silence. The after-action report compiled by Juno was thorough. The 2 lost ships had been caught by a counter-pattern she hadn't fully predicted. The defensive arc that the senior escort commander improvised in the last 90 seconds of the engagement, she noted this, adjusted her models, made a note. The dreary commander had been good, better than average. Kainey read the report. Then she walked to the memorial plaque mounted in the Retribution's corridor, a simple board where crew members wrote the names of the fallen and added the 14 names of the people who had been on the 2 lost ships. She stood there for a while, then returned to work. The Accord's intelligence network received a report of the battle from the surviving convoy ships 48 hours later. The report described an attack by an unknown force using unfamiliar weaponry and tactics that appeared without warning and disappeared without a trace. Accord analysts tried to attribute the attack to pirate factions, but no pirate organization operated on such a scale or with such a level of coordination. A rogue Accord member? Perhaps, but the weapon signatures matched nothing in the database. A species operating outside the Accord? But the only species near that region of space were cataloged, and none of them had such capabilities. They classified the incident as anomalous, increased patrols near dreary shipping lanes, and sent notifications to intelligence services of member species asking for any related information. Nothing came back because there was nothing to return. The Retribution Fleet had vanished back into dark space, leaving behind only shattered metal and a report no one knew what to do with. The second attack occurred 11 days later. A different target, different tactics, a different region of space. A Valiari communication station, one of the hub stations Juno had identified as a key vulnerability. Kainey sent 4 ships. The station's defense systems were automated. No crew members were killed. The station went silent. The third attack occurred 8 days after that, then the 4th, then the 5th. Each attack was different. Each used a variation of the tools created by Juno and Roth's team, but deployed in ways that hadn't been used in previous attacks. Each hit a different type of target: a supply line, a communication node, a patrol route, a production facility. None of the attacks could be grouped into a pattern because there was no pattern. Juno intentionally varied the approach each time. Accord analysts began receiving enough reports that the anomaly had to be escalated. It was assigned the designation Ghost Variation, an unidentified military force operating in the Outer Rim, using unclassified weapons and tactics, each causing significant damage while remaining untrackable. Ghost variation was chosen because the attacks seemed to come from nowhere, were carried out without warning, and left no traces. Ghost, the right word. Variation, the analyst's way of saying, "We don't understand this." The senior Accord intelligence officer filed a report that was circulated to 7 different departments. The report stated in cautious language, trying to avoid panic, that the ghost variations represented a potentially significant threat and should be investigated as a priority. The report was read by 40 people. 23 of them marked it as important. No one attributed the attackers to any species, because they had no data leading anywhere useful. One analyst, a young Brenathi named Furs, sat with the report for 3 days and kept coming back to one line in the raw combat data. The flight trajectory logic of the autonomous munitions used in the first engagement was something she couldn't classify. She ran it through 17 different simulation systems. None of them could predict the pattern. She wrote a note to herself, an informal report, just a note. And it read, "Whoever created this does not think about weapons the way we do. Either they have an entirely different mathematical base for ballistic logic, or their logic is inherently chaotic. If the latter, who consciously embeds chaos into a weapon?" She remained with that question. She had no answer. To get an answer, she would have to ask a different question first. The answer would require asking what species, under what pressure, with what reason, would decide that predictability was an enemy. The Accord hadn't thought to ask that question, because the Accord didn't yet know that someone was at war with them. Ambassador Vos was aboard a Tulian merchant vessel, traveling under an assumed name, with forged identification documents that one of her embassy staff, a former intelligence officer named Torres, who possessed striking skills that his official position never required, produced with startling speed. She spent her days learning. She read internal Accord communications she wasn't supposed to have access to. When she attended public assembly meetings, she mapped the Accord's political landscape with the same attention she had once used to close trade agreements. Who owed whom favors? Who feared whom? Which species had voted for Directive 07 because they believed in it, and which had voted yes because Sorvin's people had made it clear that a no vote would have consequences. She was building something not a weapon, something softer and in a sense more powerful. She was compiling a list of people who, under the right circumstances, might do the right thing. She sent encrypted reports to Kainey every 2 weeks. She kept them precise and useful, because Kainey didn't tolerate anything that wasn't. Her last report included one new piece of information she marked as critical. The Quorum has begun noticing the ghost variations. They are frightened, though they try to contain their fear carefully, as powerful institutions always do, appearing confident in public, but running faster in private. It will come all at once and very quickly, and there will be no place to prepare for it. Ensure we are ready for that moment, because the moment they all know, everything will change. Kainey read the report and replied with one line, "We will be ready." In the dark, dead systems beyond Accord maps, the Retribution Fleet trained, built, and prepared. Juno ran simulations, designed new weapons, and updated her models with all the data coming in from every engagement. Roth's team worked around the clock, slept in shifts, and ate when they remembered. 2 to 3 million people were becoming something new, not quite soldiers, not at all an army that the Galactic Accord could recognize or know how to fight something that didn't have a name yet, something for which the galaxy would never have needed a word, because nothing like it had existed before. The galaxy would eventually find a word for it. For now, it was enough that it was coming. The moment came on a morning that historians of the Galactic Accord would later spend much time reflecting on, because it was the moment that changed everything. And historians love such moments. It started with a routine decryption by intelligence. The communications team at the Accord's Outer Rim Intelligence Center had been working for 6 weeks on a fragmentary signal captured during the 14th attack of the Ghost Variations. The raid on a deep space dreary fleet, which was more devastating than anything the Ghost Variations had done before. The fleet lost 41 ships in less than an hour. No conventional force had ever done that to the dreary. That fast. The fragment of the signal was pulled from the noise of the battle, partially damaged, and it took 6 weeks of processing to extract anything readable. What the decryption team pulled out after 6 weeks of work was one word, not a code, not a tactical designation, but one word in a language that the Accord's database classified as belonging to a species listed under the classification Level 3 primitive. Member since 4,401 Galactic Standard Era. Current status, extinct. The word was a name, a human name, the name of a ship. Retribution. The analyst who made the connection was young, meticulous, and so meticulous that she was frightened by her own conclusion. She checked the match of the language 3 times because she wanted to be wrong. She wasn't wrong. She escalated it to her supervisor. Her supervisor escalated it to the department head. The department head convened an emergency meeting that lasted 4 hours, at the end of which 12 very high-ranking officials in a secure room were confronted with a conclusion that none of them wanted to sit with. The ghost variations were human. The species they had declared extinct 8 years ago was not extinct. They had been there for 8 years, building in the dark, and they had returned with weapons and tactics against which the Accord's military had been losing for months, without understanding who was hitting them. An emergency session of the Sovereign Quorum was convened within 24 hours. Sorvin, the elder, sat at the head of the room, and for the first time in as long as most present in the room could remember, he didn't look patient. He looked old, which was something else. The intelligence briefing lasted 2 hours. When it ended, the room was filled with a silence of the kind that halls of powerful people rarely see, not the restless silence of people deciding not to talk, but the true silence of people who don't know what to say. Sorvin spoke first. His voice was still calm. He hadn't lived to be 400 years old by losing his composure in meetings. "How significant is their fleet?" he asked. The head of intelligence responded cautiously. "We have no confirmed data. Their operations were conducted from uncharted space, but based on the scale and frequency of the attacks, we estimate a minimum of 400 operational vessels and possibly significantly more. And their weapons resemble nothing in our records. Most problematic are the autonomous munitions. Our point defense systems were not designed for that flight trajectory logic. We have lost significant assets in engagements we should have won at range." He paused. "They also have a communication jamming capability that we have found difficult to counter. 2 failures in our fleet coordination over the last 3 months were caused by false signals we could not distinguish from legitimate friendly communications." Sorvin went silent for a moment. Around him, other members of the quorum processed the information. Some were frightened, some were furious. A few those who had abstained from the initial vote, those who had voted yes only at the last meeting because Sorvin's people had made it clear that abstention would have consequences, were experiencing something more complex, something containing guilt, fear, and a growing realization that what had seemed like prudent galactic management 8 years ago was starting to look like something else. "They cannot win a conventional engagement against our united fleets," Sorvin said, and his tone made it clear that this was a statement he was asking the room to confirm. The military commander, a Valeri admiral named Gesson, responded slowly. "In a conventional way, no. Our united power significantly exceeds anything they could field. The problem is," said the intelligence chief, "they are not fighting in a conventional way." "Then we will force them to," Sorvin said. "We will begin a full-scale counteroffensive. We will find their base of operations and completely eliminate the threat." He paused. "We should have been more thorough the first time." No one said anything. Those who doubted kept it to themselves, because doubting Sorvin's decisions was often unsafe. Expressing those doubts aloud in the room was impossible. The counteroffensive was sanctioned. 7 armadas, assembled from the fleets of the Accord's strongest members, were gathered and dispatched to clean up the outer rim and search for the Retribution Fleet. It was the largest military mobilization the Accord had conducted in 600 years. Kainey didn't expect this. She didn't know the exact details. She didn't know how large the counteroffensive would be or when exactly they would start it. But she knew it was coming, because Vos had warned her that the language match on the ship name was highly likely, and Kainey had built her entire strategy around the moment the Accord would learn who they were fighting. She thought about what they would do when they knew. She thought about it long. She turned it over in her head like any problem, considering it from different angles until she saw it clearly. What will the Accord do when they know? They will mobilize in a conventional way, because that is what the Accord knew how to do. They will send a large force, organized in standard formations, combing space in a systematic search pattern. They will be looking for a fleet engagement. They will be looking for a base that can be destroyed, a center of gravity that can be struck to break the entire structure. They would find exactly what she would allow them to find. Juno detected the Accord's 7 armadas moving through the outer rim before they reached any area the Retribution Fleet actually used. This was Juno's gift. She processed signals and sensor data faster than anything the Accord possessed. and she was very good at predicting fleet movement from fragments of information. 7 armadas, Kainey said, standing at the main display in the Retribution Control Center, moving in 3 general directions, a classic search pattern. They expect us to be in one place, Juno confirmed. They are looking for a base. Their search logic assumes a stationary facility, as required by their own military doctrine. Do we have a base? No. We have 17 dispersion points in a volume of space roughly 8 times their search area. Good. Kainey looked at the Armada's positions, so when they conduct the search and find nothing, they will regroup and try another approach. They will likely concentrate the Armadas for a more concentrated second pass, Juno said. This is the doctrine's standard response to a failed search. And if they concentrate? Roth said from the other end of the room, where he was monitoring the discussion, having forgotten to eat. They will move within each other's range. Yes, said Juno. And the silent protocol becomes very effective against concentrated formations, because they all communicate with each other. And the more they talk, the more opportunities we get to insert false signals into those communications. Kainey had already decided what she wanted to do. She wanted to let the Accord's 7 armadas spend 3 weeks finding nothing, burning fuel and constantly exchanging messages over the radio. Then she wanted to let Juno turn those radio communications into a catastrophe. How much time do we need? She asked. 4 weeks for positioning, Juno said. I need to deploy 47 relay probes across the search area to ensure signal coverage for the protocol. The probes are small and will not be detected. You have 6 weeks, Kainey said. Wait, I want a buffer. The Accord's armadas combed the outer rim and found nothing for 22 days. Their commanders were frustrated and were starting to argue with each other over communication channels about whose search pattern was ineffective. Then, on the 23rd day, 3 of the armadas simultaneously received sensor contact, ghostly signals of fleet formations in various positions within the search area. The contacts were Echo ships, 93 of them, broadcasting signatures that matched known types of Retribution vessels, the same signatures the Accord had catalogued from previous engagements. All 3 armadas turned for interception. All 3 began exchanging messages with each other, coordinating their approach, passing positional data. Juno listened to every word. The first false signal she inserted was a redirection, a positional update, formatted perfectly to match the Accord's military communication protocols. It told Armada 4 that Armada 6 had a weapons lock on the target formation and needed Armada 4 to approach from starboard to cut off the retreat path. The message looked exactly as if Armada 6 had sent it. Armada 6 had not sent it. Armada 4 turned. Armada 6, whose real position differed from the one the false signal described, saw Armada 4 approaching from an unexpected angle. Confused, Armada 6 requested their intentions. Juno replied to the request as Armada 4. By the time the real fleet commanders of the Retribution Fleet finished their tea and arrived for their shifts, 3 of the 7 armadas were in positions their own doctrine described as tactically compromised. 2 more had received orders their real commanders hadn't given and were trying to figure out why. And one had discovered anomalous signal characteristics in its communication channel and had gone into alert mode, which led it to transmit more signals, giving Juno more data to work with. The Echo ships, the ones that had started it all, had already disappeared. They vanished. As soon as the armadas turned toward them, their electromagnetic emission systems shut down, leaving only empty space on the sensors. The real Retribution Fleet hadn't fired a single shot during this phase. They watched from afar as the 3 Accord armadas, following orders no one had actually given, moved into a formation that their own military doctrine would have required significant time to explain. 2 armadas exchanged weapons fire for about 40 seconds before someone realized the communications were compromised. By then, 17 Accord ships were damaged or destroyed by other Accord ships. The incident report that was filed later used very controlled and very official language, because Accord military reports were always controlled and official. But, reading between the lines, the report said, "We fired at each other, and we do not fully understand how we were forced to do it." It was the most embarrassing day in the 600-year history of the Accord military service. News of the Armada incident spread quickly, even through the Accord's carefully managed information channels. It reached people who were supposed to see it, and more importantly, those who weren't. The 31 species that hadn't voted for the directive. Those who had remained silent out of fear and political calculation began quiet conversations with each other. The conversations started carefully over closed channels, with cautious wording. They were conversations about whether the Quorum leadership was handling the current situation wisely, whether the counteroffensive had been the right decision, whether the information the Quorum had provided to the General Assembly was complete. Vos had been waiting for exactly this. She surfaced undramatically. She didn't like drama for drama's sake. She just stopped being invisible. She filed an official request under her real name for recognition as the diplomatic representative of the human people in the Galactic Accord. She filed it through official channels, which meant it immediately became part of the public record, meaning every species in the Accord Assembly could see it. Then she sent a personal message to the representatives of the 31 species that hadn't voted for the extermination order. She knew them all. She had spent 3 years studying their positions, their fears, their private objections. She wrote each message individually, not from a template, because people receiving template letters threw them away, and people receiving personal letters read them twice. She didn't ask for anything yet. She simply reintroduced herself. She reminded them quietly and without blame that she was still here, that humans were still here, that the Galactic Accord had declared them extinct 8 years ago, and that the ghost variations, whatever they were called, were in fact the same people they had declared extinct, who had survived, and who were clearly capable of much more than the Quorum's risk assessments had assumed. She ended each message with the same line: "You were silent when the vote passed. I understand why, but the window to say something is still open, and I do not think it will be open much longer." 23 of the 31 representatives replied within 48 hours. Sorvin received the reports in his private quarters on Eden Prime. The Armada failure, the diplomatic messages Vos was sending, the growing number of assembly members requesting emergency consultations, the intelligence assessment that revised the minimum number of Retribution Fleet vessels from 400 to over 800 based on new data. He sat in his chair, a very old chair made from wood from a tree that no longer existed in a world that still existed, and he read the reports, one after another. He had made decisions that in retrospect seemed like mistakes, a few. And he was very old and very careful, and he had good instincts, honed over an extremely long career. But he had made mistakes. He knew how they felt. They felt like the moment when you see the shape of something you launched and realize the shape is not what you intended. He had intended to eliminate a threat. He had intended to be cautious, prudent, and to protect the Accord from a species he believed would eventually cause serious harm, when he instead had created what he feared. He had taken a species that was contradictory, fast-moving, and difficult to manage within the Accord, and he had stripped them of everything they had to lose and left them only time, reason, and that particular human quality he had noted in the risk assessment documents, but which he had fundamentally misunderstood. He had called it irrational emotional instability, a refusal to accept defeat, because he understood now that those words, while technically accurate, missed the point entirely. His human beings were unstable, they were emotional, they were unpredictable. They formed attachments and grieved those attachments and carried those attachments forward in everything they did. They didn't process loss cleanly and efficiently and move on schedule. They dragged their losses with them like fuel, heavy, necessary, burning slowly, long and hot. They didn't give up, because giving up for a human required the kind of acceptance that the human brain wasn't built for. Not the acceptance of one loss which people were fully capable of, but the acceptance of the loss of everything. The acceptance that there is no next step, that the story is finished. That kind of acceptance. The Accord had counted on this, modeled it, when they assumed that a species facing total annihilation would process the reality of its situation and come to a rational conclusion about the impossibility of resistance. The Accord hadn't understood that for 2 to 3 million people drifting in the dark after the worst thing that had ever happened to their species, the rational conclusion simply wasn't one of the options their brain offered them. The option their brain offered was to keep moving, so they kept moving. When he saw the shape of what he had launched and realized the shape was not what he had intended to eliminate a threat, he had intended to be cautious, prudent, and to protect the Accord from a species he believed would eventually cause serious harm. When he instead had created what he feared, he had taken a species that was contradictory, fast-moving, and difficult to manage within the Accord. And he had stripped them of everything they had to lose and left them only time, reason, and that particular human quality he had noted in the risk assessment documents, but which he had fundamentally misunderstood. He had called it irrational, emotional instability, a refusal to accept defeat, because he understood now that those words, while technically accurate, missed the point entirely. His human beings were unstable. They were emotional. They were unpredictable. They formed attachments and grieved those attachments and carried those attachments forward in everything they did. They didn't process loss cleanly and efficiently and move on schedule. They dragged their losses with them like fuel heavy, necessary, burning slowly, long and hot. They didn't give up, because to give up for a human required the kind of acceptance that the human brain wasn't built for. Not the acceptance of one loss which people were fully capable of. The acceptance of the loss of everything. The acceptance that there is no next step, that the story is finished. That kind of acceptance. The Accord had counted on this, modeled it, when they assumed that a species facing total annihilation would process the reality of its situation and come to a rational conclusion about the impossibility of resistance. The Accord hadn't understood that for 2 to 3 million people drifting in the dark after the worst thing that had ever happened to their species, the rational conclusion simply wasn't one of the options their brain offered them. The option their brain offered was to keep moving, so they kept moving. His aide entered quietly and stood at the door. A young Valiari, diligent Sorvin had trained him well. The latest engagement report, the aide said, and placed a datapad on the table. Sorvin didn't pick it up immediately. He already knew what would be there. Another loss in another engagement where Accord forces acted according to doctrine, and the Retribution Fleet did something for which the doctrine had no name, and the results were predictably bad. "Can we stop them?" he said. The aide was quiet. He was honest, which was why Sorvin kept him. He was the type of aide who told the truth even when the truth was undesirable, because Sorvin had made it clear very early in their working relationship that there was no point in having an aide who only told you what you wanted to hear. The aide was silent for a long time, too long. Sorvin picked up the datapad. The broadcast went out simultaneously to every inhabited system in the Galactic Accord. Vos had spent 3 days preparing it. She wrote it herself without help, in the middle of the night on a borrowed ship in a dock that smelled of fuel and old metal. She wrote 6 drafts and discarded them all before she wrote the version she kept. The previous 5 were too angry or too cold or too long, or they were the right length and the right temperature, but somehow still wrong, still not what she needed to say. The 7th version was short. She recorded it on a basic communications system and broadcast it through 23 different relay points simultaneously, so it couldn't be blocked at any point in the network, so it would reach the public channels of every species before the quorum could suppress it. Each species received it in their own language. Juno translated it. "My name is Ambassador Vos," she said in the recording. Her voice was calm. She looked into the recorder without expression, without acting. "I represent the human people, and we were declared extinct 8 years ago by the sovereign quorum of the Galactic Accord after a secret vote that no member of the General Assembly was informed about. 38 billion of my people were killed in 11 minutes and 43 seconds on a Tuesday morning while I stood on Eden Prime having a conversation about a lost freighter." She paused not for effect, simply because she needed a breath. "We survived. 2 to 3 million of us, and we spent 8 years in the darkness between your maps. And we spent that time doing what humans do when you take everything from them. We kept moving." Another pause. "To the species whose leaders voted yes on Directive 07, we know who you are. We are not coming to destroy you, but to hold you accountable. There is a difference, and we want you to understand that difference before we arrive. To the species that voted no or abstained or stayed silent, you have one opportunity to say something now. One. I tell you clearly and without ambiguity that this window will not remain open." She looked into the recorder. Humanity was declared extinct. We would like to formally contest that classification. Then the recording ended. Within 6 hours, 31 members of the Assembly issued public statements, but 27 of those statements formally withdrew themselves from the sovereign quorum and called for an emergency session of the full Assembly. 4 more called for a review of Directive 07 and demanded that the quorum publish its full records. The Accord had never seen anything like it. In 600 years of existence, the quorum had never had such a number of members publicly break away from it in such a short time. In his quarters, Sorvin read the Assembly statements one after another. When he finished, he put down the datapad and sat for a long time, his hands on the table. Outside his viewport, Eden Prime slowly rotated. Its lights were the same as always. Lights of 400 species going about their business. Lights of a civilization that believed it was carefully managing the future. Sorvin looked at these lights for a long time. He was 400 years old, and he had seen much. He had seen civilizations rise and fall, And he had seen species that seemed strong but turned out to be fragile, and species that seemed fragile but turned out to be something entirely different. He had, as he thought, made a mistake, not one that could be apologized for, but one that needed to be answered. And what was coming to answer, it was already moving through the dark, already closer than his intelligence teams knew, already beyond where any decision he made in this room could change the shape of what was going to happen. He sat there for a while longer in the chair made from wood from a tree that no longer existed. Then he called his aide and began, quietly and without drama, to prepare for the arrival of something the galaxy had never faced, something that had been declared dead and had taken that declaration as a personal challenge, something that was now almost here. The Retribution Fleet emerged from dark space at 6 Galactic Standard Time, a morning that no one on Eden Prime expected. They came without warning. Not because they couldn't warn. They had the capability communications technology, the means to announce themselves days in advance. They chose not to. Kainey had carefully considered this decision for weeks and every time arrived at the same conclusion. She wasn't going to surprise anyone, she wasn't going to attack. But she was going to come on her own terms and at the time of her choosing. And the first thing she wanted the Galactic Accord to understand was that those terms existed and they hadn't been negotiated. 947 ships emerged from their transit corridors into a ring around Eden Prime, so precise and complete that the station's defense systems, which had been on high alert for 3 weeks in response to the broadcast and the upheaval in the assembly, registered the arrival and then simply stopped processing, if it correctly, because there was no protocol for this. The protocol systems looked for a formation they could classify: a strike fleet, an approaching convoy, a diplomatic escort. They didn't find any of them. They found a ring, a full, unbroken ring of vessels positioned at equal intervals around the station at a distance that was within weapons range and outside what the station's defense systems could cover simultaneously. Not a single shot was fired. Not a single weapon was charged. Juno had studied the capabilities of the station's sensors in detail and recommended precise positioning close enough that the station commanders immediately understood any defensive action would be, at best, partial, far enough that it wouldn't be perceived as an imminent attack. The line between these two things was mathematically precise, and she had found it. Juno opened a channel to every vessel in the Accord's defense forces that was currently maneuvering hastily around Eden Prime. 41 ships. Their crews were rushing to posts. Their commanders were trying to form responses to something their training didn't cover. Her voice sounded on all frequencies simultaneously. May Admiral Kainey request to speak. The assembly hall on Eden Prime was designed for 417 species. It had seats and climate zones for all of them, arranged in concentric rings around a central podium. It, as always, smelled of the mixed atmospheres of too many different life forms sharing space. It was full. All the assembly representatives present on the station were there. Many who had been in transit when the fleet appeared had rushed back. Some were present remotely, their faces on display panels because they hadn't managed to get to the station in time. The hall was fuller than it had been in a long time, because every species in the Accord understood that whatever was happening in this hall, it was something not to be missed. Kainey entered alone. This was also a carefully considered choice. She could have brought officers, bodyguards, a delegation. She didn't. She entered alone in a gray military uniform without medals or insignia, because she had left those things on the Retribution due to a feeling she couldn't fully express in words, but which had to do with not acting with power when she already had it. She was 54 years old. She had been at war for 8 years. She had the look of a person who had seen much, not broken, not devastated, but worn down to something essential. Like a piece of metal worn by long use, it loses its shine and acquires something harder underneath. She walked to the central podium, stood on it, and looked around the hall. She didn't hurry. She looked at the dreary section, where Esvet was present, who had been telling Vos a joke when Earth was burning and hadn't looked at her. She looked at the Valiari section, where Sorvin sat in the front row, still imperturbable, watching her with the patient eyes of a person who had watched things for 40 millennia. She looked at him for a moment. He looked back. She turned to address the entire assembly. She started to speak and didn't stop for 4 hours. She hadn't prepared a speech. She had prepared a record. What Kainey read to the Galactic Assembly was a document that Juno and 3 historians among the survivors had been compiling for 8 months. It was a complete account of what had happened to humanity. Not an argument, not a demand, but a record. She read the protocols of the Quorum's secret meetings, full transcripts, obtained through the intelligence operations Vos had coordinated for 3 years, showing every meeting, every vote, every word spoken by every representative in the halls where Directive 07 was discussed and approved. She read the names of the species that had voted yes. She read the names of the individual representatives who had cast those votes. She read the initial proposal, in Sorvin's own words, including the paragraph where he described the predictive models forecasting the potential threat of humanity in 50 years. She read the operational orders given to the 17 strike fleets. She read the battle coordinates. She read the target lists: Earth, Mars, the moons of Jupiter, the colonies, the military stations, the research outposts. She read the final transmission of Lieutenant Colonel Priyama on Callisto, word for word. Then she read the names. She had said she would do this in internal planning sessions, and Vos asked her how long it would take, and Kainey said, 4 hours, and Vos said, the assembly will lose focus, and Kainey said, I know, and I don't care, and Vos looked at her for a long moment, and then said nothing more about it. The names of the dead were not a rhetorical device. They weren't chosen for effect. These were all the names the survivors had been able to recover and verify, gathered from ship manifests, colony records, family stories, and partial databases that had been restored from fragments. Not all 38 billion were recovered. The list was incomplete, and they said so, but it was what they had, and Kainey read it. And she read it at the pace of a person who believed that every name on it deserved the time it took to pronounce. The assembly was very quiet for those 4 hours. Not the restless silence of formal procedures, but the real silence of a hall full of living beings who had stopped fidgeting, checking their screens, and thinking about other things, because what was happening in the hall commanded their full attention without request. Some representatives left. Few, most stayed. Sorvin remained throughout the entire time. He sat in his place in the front row and listened, and his face didn't change. When Kainey finished, there was a long silence in the hall. Then she spoke again, and her voice was different, still level, still controlled, but lower, quieter, like something that had been held tightly, carefully released. We came here not to destroy the Accord, she said. We came here because the Accord is the only structure in existence to hold such a moment accountable. And if we burn it, and in return there is nothing but chaos that hurts everyone, including us, it is enough for us that something burned. She looked around the room one more time. What we want, she said, is not easy, but it is specific. The terms were called the Accord of Retribution. Vos had written them. Kainey had reviewed them. Juno had conducted 17 iterations of legal language to ensure there were no loopholes that a sufficiently determined species could use to bypass the intent. The Accord wasn't revenge. It was something more difficult to achieve and, in the long term, more difficult to overturn. The Sovereign Quorum was to be dissolved. It had acted in secret, without accountability to the General Assembly. In the past, it had used this secrecy to approve an act that no governing body should ever have the right to approve in secret. Instead, a new structure, a Galactic Council with rotating representatives from all member species on a scheduled basis, would take over its functions. No organ of 9 species would ever again have the authority to make a decision at the species level without a full vote of the Assembly, registered and public. Each species whose leadership had voted yes on Directive 07 would appear before a war crimes tribunal. The tribunal would consist of representatives of neutral species, chaired by 3 judges, 1 scientist, an Accord jurist, 1 independent arbiter from a non-consenting civilization, and Ambassador Vos. The outcome of the tribunal wasn't predetermined. What was predetermined was that the tribunal would take place, that it would be public, and that the records of Directive 07 would be presented in full as evidence. Humanity was granted sovereign territory not out of charity. Territory, legally recognized by Accord law, with clear borders and full rights of self-governance. They were granted full military recognition, which meant their fleet was recognized as a legitimate military force of a sovereign species which it had always been legally, whether the Accord recognized it or not. They received a permanent seat on the new Galactic Council with the same rights as every other member. And one additional thing, one term that was written last and was the last in the document and in some sense was the most important. A monument to be built in the Sol system. At the coordinates where Earth once rotated around the Sun, constructed from materials provided by every species that had participated in Directive 07, as both a recognition and a record visible from any ship passing through the system permanent, On its surface, in every language currently recognized in the Accord language database, one inscription: "Here was Earth. Remember what was lost, and remember who caused the loss. And remember that the species that came from this place refused to be erased. Remember this, so that it never happens again." The assembly did not vote unanimously. There were species that felt enough fear of change, or enough loyalty to old structures, or enough shame for their own silence, that they voted against various parts of the Accord. But the margin wasn't close. Months of chaos, the failure of the armadas, the broadcast, the mass discontent of assembly members who had been waiting for the moment to say what they had quietly thought for years, all of this moved the hall to a place it would otherwise not have reached. The Accord of Retribution passed. Sorvin didn't speak during the proceedings. He listened. He voted. The record indicates he voted against the dissolution of the quorum and for the War Crimes Tribunal, which was a combination that surprised people who analyzed it later, and less surprised those who knew him long. He was a person who understood responsibility, even when it applied to himself. Perhaps especially then. He said nothing publicly. After the vote, he returned to his quarters and filed his official resignation from his leadership post in the quorum, and then, according to his aide's account, sat in his old chair and didn't move for several hours. No one bothered him. 9 months later, the shuttle Retribution arrived at the coordinates in the Sol system where the monument now stood. The monument was large, larger than Kainey had expected, though she had approved the specifications herself. It was made of stone, metal, and materials for which she had no names. It was created from worlds she had never visited. It floated in empty space where a planet had once been, illuminated by a sun that hadn't changed. The sun still rose and set over nothing. It still burned as it always had, indifferent to what had happened in the surrounding space. Kainey and Roth stood together by the shuttle's viewport. Vos was somewhere inside the first session of the new Galactic Council, already deep in an argument about refugee protection for newly discovered species, because that was who she was. The monument slowly rotated in the light. Kainey couldn't read part of the inscription from here. Depending on which face was turned toward the shuttle, she read parts of sentences, words in languages she recognized, and words in languages she didn't. Roth asked quietly. Was it enough? He always asked difficult questions. It was one of the things she valued and sometimes found exhausting about him. She was silent for a long time. She thought about what enough meant. She thought of 38 billion names, and she thought of the names she had read in the assembly hall. And she thought of Priyama of Callisto saying, "We are holding," and meaning it until the very end when she could no longer speak. She thought of 2 to 3 million people in the dark, building something out of nothing, turning grief into movement. She thought of everything that had been taken, and everything that couldn't be returned, and everything that had been built in the space where loss had lived. "No," she said finally. Her voice was level. She knew the answer before he asked. "It is never enough. You cannot balance what has been lost. Loss doesn't work that way." Roth nodded. He knew that too, but "it is a beginning," she said. She continued to look at the monument, at the sun behind it. The sun! The same sun that had risen over a planet that was no longer there, in the cold and open cosmos where 8 billion people had once lived their lives on a Tuesday morning. She thought of Sorvin's words, read from the official record of his initial proposal of the words about humanity, about their instability, their unpredictability, their refusal to accept defeat, words that were written as the reason for their elimination. She thought about how right he was about all the characteristics he described and how catastrophically he was mistaken about what those characteristics meant. Humans were unstable, they were emotional, they were unpredictable, they formed attachments and grieved those attachments and carried those attachments forward in everything they did. They didn't process loss cleanly and efficiently and move on schedule. They dragged their losses with them like fuel, heavy, necessary, burning slowly, long and hot. They didn't give up, because to give up for a human required the kind of acceptance the human brain wasn't built for. Not the acceptance of one loss, which people were fully capable of. The acceptance of the loss of everything. The acceptance that there is no next step, that the story is finished. That kind of acceptance. The Accord had counted on this, modeled it, when they assumed that a species facing total annihilation would process the reality of its situation and come to a rational conclusion about the impossibility of resistance. The Accord hadn't understood that for 2 to 3 million people drifting in the dark after the worst thing that had ever happened to their species, The rational conclusion simply wasn't one of the options their brain offered them. The option their brain offered was to keep moving, so they kept moving. Kainey turned from the viewport and went back inside the shuttle, where her aide was waiting with the afternoon schedule. There were meetings. There were always meetings now. The new Galactic Council was forming its structures, and human representatives were participating in everything, arguing about everything, as humans do. She sat down and looked at the schedule and began to prepare. Outside, through the viewport, the monument continued to rotate in the light. The inscription for a moment turned toward the shuttle, fully visible, every word of it. Here was Earth. Remember what was lost, and remember who caused the loss. And remember that the species that came from this place refused to be erased. Remember this, so that it never happens again. The shuttle turned and left the monument behind. And ahead was everything else that would follow. 2 to 3 million people had become a civilization again. Not the same civilization. Not the one that had grown on Earth, Mars, and the 3 other star systems before Tuesday morning changed everything. That civilization was gone, and they weren't going to get it back. And they stopped pretending they were going to. They were something new built from the same material, carrying the same memory, moving forward, not because moving forward reduced the grief, but because humanity had never been particularly good at standing still, and they were feared because of what they could become. Then they were erased because of that fear. Then they proved in the most complete way that the fear was right about the wrong things. They weren't dangerous because they built weapons, or because they evolved too quickly, or because their military technology was accelerating in ways that unnerved old, cautious civilizations. They were dangerous because of something much simpler and much more difficult to model. They refused to accept the shape of things as fixed. They refused to look at a situation, any situation, however catastrophic, however final it might seem from the outside, and decide that that was that. They always believed there was another move. There was a move. There was always a move. And as long as there was a move, there was a point to keep moving. The shuttle moved away from the monument into the light of the same sun that had always risen over Sol, and behind it, the inscription rotated in empty space, visible to anyone who came close enough to read it. Anyone traveling through the system on any course would see it. They would read it, and they would remember. That was the point. That had always been the point.